So hello and welcome to the panel discussion on the Regent Honeyeater. I'm Jane Powles. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the Blue Mountains World Heritage Institute, and it's my honour actually to be here facilitating this panel conversation today. Before I start, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gundungurra and the Darug people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And in doing so, recognise that this was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I recognise the custodianship of the land and over many years, thousands of years, and appreciate the sharing of country with us. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people that we have in the room today. So welcome to this discussion. I first met Ro and Mandy, I think in my first week when I was working at the Institute, and was fascinated in the story of the song of the Regent Honeyeater. Their project, Lost Song, is a visual interpretation of the song of the critically endangered Regent Honeyeater. And the exhibition includes sculptural installation. It includes a wall drawing and a commissioned sound work by Felicity Wilcox. The project that is on exhibit here, and if you haven't seen it, I do encourage you to go and have a look after this conversation. It has been supported by the Blue Mountains City Council and also the accompanying audio supported by the New South Wales Government through Create New South Wales. So our discussion today will go for about an hour and a half, and there will be time for a Q&A before we wrap up. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our panel today. We have Ian Patterson from BirdLife Southern New South Wales. Ian is also their representative on the National Regent Honeyeater Recovery team. We have Carol PROBETS next to Ian. Carol is a bird surveyor and guide and Vice President of the Blue Mountains Bird Observers. To my left, we have Cara Stevens. Cara is a zookeeper and head of the Regent Honeyeater breeding program from Western Plains Zoo in Dubbo. We have Daniel Appleby, who's with the Difficult Bird Research Group at ANU and is undertaking his PhD on the Regent Honeyeater, song learning and socially learned behaviours. And on my right, in the far end, we have MYLES OAKEY, who's with the University of Sydney, undertaking his PhD on the significance of song in conservation of the Regent Honeyeater. So I will just ask all of the panellists to do a quick introduction of the work that they're doing, and then we will dive into a conversation with Ro and Mandy after that. So Ian.
Hi. Well, as Jane mentioned, I'm a member of the BirdLife Southern New South Wales group. It was set up in 1993, and I was on the initial committee. We were looking for a conservation project that we could undertake, which would provide an opportunity for members living in our region to become involved in a hands-on way. And we decided on doing something in the Capertee Valley. It's a well-known birding spot, and it is known as a key area for Regent Honeyeaters. And the Regent Honeyeater's plight was just becoming really recognised at that time, and the first steps have been taken to establish a recovery plan for the species. So we initiated a project which initially included various monitoring programs and a breeding biology study, and also tree planting on the private property in the valley. And this tree planting project has continued right through to the present. The valley is an important area for Regent Honeyeaters, but the floor of the valley, which is where they but only frequent, has been heavily cleared, and what remaining habitat there is was highly fragmented and often degraded. But we began the first planting in 1994, and we've been planting twice a year since then, with a few exceptions such as COVID. And to date we've planted about, I think it's 285 hectares of land, and I think the number of trees is something like 145,000 foot in. And that's all done by volunteers, and we commonly get between 80 and 150 people at each of these weekend plantings. And there's quite a bit of information on our website, and we actually have a planting coming up in May, so if you're interested in perhaps becoming involved or having a look at the valley, then that would be a good opportunity.
Thanks, Ian. And Carol.
Hi. Is this working? Yeah. I saw my first Regent Honeyeater in 1988, and back then, even then, they were recognised as declining. It was about 10 years after that I first became involved in the Regent Honeyeater project. That's the project that Ian was talking about. And along with that, I also became part of a small team that were radio tracking Regent Honeyeaters in the Capertee Valley. We did that over 2 summers to try and find out where they go at a time of year when there are very few Regent Honeyeater sightings. About the same time as that, I got into I started working as a birding guide. So I was guiding, visiting mostly international birders around the Blue Mountains and Capertee Valley. And my most often requested bird was the Regent Honeyeater. So I spent a lot of time looking for Regent Honeyeaters, and I couldn't have done that without a good association with BirdLife Australia, and a two-way exchange of information ongoing to try and keep tabs on where the regents were and where they were breeding. The one thing that really struck me over my 20-odd years as a birding guide was how much more difficult they became to find over that time. You know, towards the end of that time, they've become really hard to find. Like, they were always hard to find, but much harder than they were previously. And in more recent years, I've pivoted away from bird guiding and done more work surveying, doing bird surveys. And again, a lot of that has been focused on Regent Honeyeaters. So I'll probably get a chance to talk a bit more about that later on. The main thing that interests me personally about Regent Honeyeaters is that they're an incredibly enigmatic bird. They're sporadic, they're unpredictable movements, and the fact that they rely on, you know, a particular rich flowering of eucalypts. I find that fascinating. They're a very mysterious, enigmatic bird.
Thanks, Carol. I concur with that mysterious thought. Myles.
So my research is in a field called the Environmental Humanities, and it's a space where we try to bring together the knowledges of the natural sciences and the humanities, and so bring them into conversation with one another in a generative way. So that, say, an ecological question, or an environmental question, I should say, is not just ecological, but it's also political, and it's ethical, it's economic, and cultural. And so we're trying to work towards holding together complexity, holding together richness, multiplicity, and thinking through the complexities of a particular situation, this one being the Regent Honeyeater. And so my work is moving through a range of disciplines. It's very interdisciplinary, so it involves looking or using skills from anthropology, from science and technology studies, thinking about how science is done, philosophical ethology, which is thinking about animal behaviour, and extinction studies, the ethics of extinction and thinking about extinction at this time. So that's a lot of fields and moving across a range of things, but it helps me to work through the complexity, to pay attention to it in particular kinds of ways that might be necessary for this particular case, for this bird. And so, yeah, the focus of my thesis is really about the song, because the song is what's really become critical for this species. And so how does song bring a certain kind of attention to the way we do conservation biology, to the way that we do science, to the way that we do birding, listening, field surveys? What kind of knowledge is produced through an attention to sound is kind of the main focus. And so there's many things that I find fascinating about these birds, but one aspect is the way that what we achieve or what we want to know is kind of at the boundaries of what those tools allow us to do. And so we're really stretching at our capacity to understand and know this bird in the way that we need to in order to intervene in really important ways. And so I'm hoping that what I'm able to do is think about how that's done and what we might need to do differently in order to move forward.
Thanks, Miles. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Passing now to Cara.
Hi, it's working, yes. Hi, I'm Cara. I'm very fortunate to be the person on the ground at the zoo-based breeding program level, so I get to work with these birds every day, and that's an absolute privilege. Is that me? Okay, goodness. Sorry. So it's an absolute privilege to be able to do that on a day-to-day basis and work with all these passionate people that can come out and do their research or just be so interested in seeing this species up close and personal. One of the most exciting things I think about a Regent Honeyeater in the zoo-based system is just how inquisitive they are. They just want to know what you are doing on a day-to-day basis. If you've got some sort of novel item or someone new comes in, they're just like, what are you doing? What is that? Hello. And they're just, it's hard to see their struggles in the wild when in the zoo-based system, they're thriving under our care. Of course, we have those supplementations of food and everything else, but working with them on the ground is extremely exciting. This program out in Dubbo in Taronga Western Plains started in 2019. So my background is a lot of birds and other species in the zoo system, but I had the luck to be able to come out here to Dubbo, we're not too far away, and work with this species as a new recovery program component and the expansion out from Sydney and other institutions of the breeding program. So in doing so, we've been able to at least double our capacity and be able to provide this species and make sure that we have the genetic lines that we need to release them back into the wild. Personally, I've been involved in 2 Regent Honeyeater releases now, up down in the Tamalpin woodlands in the Hunter Valley. Our recent one was in November of 2022, and then we did one in 2021 as well in October. So far, those have been quite successful, and it seems to be a pretty strong stronghold in that area for the Regent Honeyeater, and we are still seeing quite a few wild birds there now. And the most recent communications is that our captive birds that have been released are mingling with them. So they are hanging out with the wild population, and they have been for quite some time now. And this is past the 10 weeks post-monitoring that we normally do. But there might be opportunities to actually continue to monitor this population because we really don't know what they're doing when they leave those areas, and they seem to be hanging around this area a lot longer than may have been predicted. So being able to have those communications back to me and then to share it with our team who are on the ground is extraordinary, and hopefully this trend continues and all the amazing work that we're doing and everyone is doing can help contribute to this species hopefully getting back up to those booming numbers we saw pre-90s, but we'll do our best.
Thanks, Cara. Daniel.
Hey everybody, I'm Dan. I'm with the Difficult Bird Research Group in Canberra at the ANU. I'm a relative newcomer to Regent Honeyeaters compared with Ian and Carol. I've been working on them since 2020. I work fairly closely with Cara and the team at Taronga in Sydney. My research focuses mostly on song, the decline of wild song, and also trying to re-establish some wild type songs in captivity. So if anybody here doesn't know about the decline of song in Regent Honeyeaters, we've seen a real rapid shift in the wild in the way they sing, but also in the captive population, where the original population was established from hand-reared birds. They didn't learn typical wild songs. So my research mostly focuses on trying to teach birds to sing in a zoo, which is a bit of a weird job, I know, but I think it's an important one. Yeah, that's all from me.
Thank you. That's a great segue to finally reach Ro and to meet Ro and Mandy. Ro and Mandy, I've got a question for you. So since I met you, the whole idea of the song being something that was kind of mystical, and there's almost a kind of a mythology around it that I just find fascinating. You were particularly interested in the loss of it, and that has inspired your current artwork. Would you like to share with us some of your inspirations and why the Regent Honeyeater? And a little bit about the song.
Well, we were excited to understand that it's not an instinctive call like a lot of birds have, that it's a taught song, and that there is more involved in the tune of the melody. And it was an article that we read in early 2021 about a local bird, and it says how an endangered Australian songbird is forgetting its love song. What happens to a species if the music starts to die, or when their songs become corrupted, or their singers have never heard the original tunes. This was in The Guardian, and by Graham Redfern. And we thought, how are we going to make it visually interpret this so other people could understand it, rather than it being painting the regent or something. We wanted it to be a concept to encourage imagination and action.
Yeah. And am I correct that we might have an example of it here?
So with this, on this Xeno Canto site, there is also spectrographs, which in time frequency recordings, and from that we translated to the charcoal wall drawings, as a graphic score or glyphs. And on the floor in the exhibition, sculpture Fallen Forest, which are found tree branches which we have wrapped in and painted with bitumen to preserve them. They were found at Mount Victoria on Mandy's property.
Thank you. And Dan, can you tell us a bit about the song of the Regent Honeyeater, and particularly I've heard the song changes over time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So the song changes over time at a population level. So in my experience, and maybe Ian, Carol might have something to say about this as well, but in my experience, normally songbirds are relatively fixed between 8 and 12 months in their singing. So an individual is unlikely to change in any dramatic way as an adult, but at a population level, the song is changed. We've observed this a few times, and at the moment we're working on a very rapid shift. So the second recording that was played then to mime is a sort of typical Blue Mountains dialect, as we would call it. But that song we have basically not detected in the wild surveys that we do in the last 2 seasons, and it's been almost entirely replaced with a simpler version of that, which we call the Blue Mountains clipped song. It's missing one of those syllables, so it's declining. But previous to that, the song was different, as sort of resembled the Tablelands dialect. So in the Blue Mountains, in the 90s, the recordings we see are all quite different to this. So yeah, it does change over time. Unfortunately, the trend we're seeing at the moment is that the songs are becoming simpler, and quite often songs of other species. So we're seeing such a low density that young birds aren't having the opportunity to learn from adult conspecifics that are around that are suitable tutors, and they're sometimes picking up little bits or the entire part of other species song, which we might talk about this later, but probably isn't very good for the species at large, because we know that song is important in defending territories, but also attracting a mate. And for a species that's declining, attracting a mate and making chicks is probably a very important part of their story.
Thanks, Dan. Ian or Carol, do you have anything to add there? Not at this point. I do have a question for Miles. Miles, I know the song's really important in conservation. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, in terms of conservation, I mean, all I've learnt about birdsong biology and about how science is done is through reading the papers of a lot of the researchers at the Difficult Birds Research Group. And so part of my approach is getting to know the science really, really well and reading really closely all those articles, and then going to the scientists and asking more questions about what they do and how they come about doing it. And so a lot of it is, how is this knowledge produced, is a question that I tend to come back to. And what are the tools in which we come to know certain things, and what are the consequences of that knowledge? Because that knowledge that's produced impacts ways that we intervene in these birds' lives. We change behaviours, we change song trajectories, we change flock densities, all through our actions. And so there is, a lot of consequence for how knowledge is made. And we can see a range of knowledges that are, here on the panel. We have visual ways of knowing, musical ways of understanding. We have scientific ways of doing analysis through different types of recordings and visual analysis, spectrograms and so on. Breeding protocols, conservation biology protocols of how to keep genetics intact, listening skills and doing field research and birding. So there's a range of ways in which we come to sense and know and make sense of song. So song is not one thing. Sometimes we see a spectrogram up on the walls in the artistic version, and we see the spectrogram and it appears as it is, or we hear it as one single thing, but it's many things. It's made up of a broader way of life that goes into shape that song and how it exists. And so thinking about the work that Cara and Dan are doing, it's always involved in a sort of co-shaping of song with these birds. So the birds are doing the learning and the teaching and the singing. We're also involved in how that's done, and we release those birds. We're involved in shaping the song that exists out in the forest. And so there's a set of relationships here that we're really working to pay attention to.
Thanks, Miles. Cara, from a zoo perspective, do you have any sort of commentary on that?
On the song. Yes, the song is, I hear it every day, and it's sadly the recordings that we have previous to this year's cohort anyway sound nothing like them. All the birds in the system, I guess, that I have dealt with just make their own song. I mean, they still sound extremely beautiful, but when Dan came along with his recordings, I honestly didn't even recognise it really. not until the first release that I've been to in 2021, I'd never actually seen a wild regent, so that was a highlight. They were not calling at this point in time. There was a nest there, and the female was breeding and all that. But yeah, when Dan came along with this recording, none of my birds sounded anything like it. So trying to set that up and then get that year's juveniles learning that song was quite interesting and quite a good experience for me and everyone else in the group, and just seeing how they are adapting into their environment, but then also trying to adapt to that song that they're hearing through a speaker is very interesting. But this year, out at Dubbo anyway, they've been doing it at Sydney for a few years, but in Dubbo we've finally got our first 2 live tutors, I would say. So they're from wild genetic backgrounds to teach our juvenile cohort this year. So currently we've got 11 birds in with 2 tutors. Some of those are females though, just to break it up a little bit so there's not too much male testosterone going on. So what's happening right now is these are chicks that have hatched out since August being our earliest, and then even up until more recently in December. We've got juveniles learning face-to-face from these adult birds, and it's really only been the last couple of weeks that they've really started to show their true colours. There's always birds in the group. There's always juveniles that want to be the loudest, of course. It's like children, isn't it? So we've got a few in that cohort that are really going out of their way to just call and starting to actually put some syllables together. Our 2 adults were very quiet for some time until more recently, and they've started to really get in the face of these birds, these juveniles, and really teach them. So me and Dan and others have found that that's extremely important, is to have that face-to-face learning. So we're seeing a huge difference just from last year's cohort with the speakers to this year's cohort with the live tutors. So that is really exciting for all of us on the ground. And then to have that connection with them, and then also the birds in Sydney who also are doing the live tutoring, means that the future looks really bright for tutoring birds to get their song back and be able to do that in all the institutions around the country that hold these birds, whereas Taronga is the largest institution that holds these birds. To be able to find maybe a protocol that we can implement for all the zoos to be able to do this, then we can bring that song back, and then we can release them back into their environment where they know what the other ones are talking about, which is very interesting. As a zoo-based breeding program, just quickly with the song, we don't see much. There's no hindrance. They don't know what the wild birds sound like. So we've had no issue with breeding the birds in the zoo, even if the boys they sound like they do in the zoo, but the girls don't care. They're just like, okay, sure. So they don't know any different, I guess. So we've had no issues so far in that regard. But yeah, studies are continuing, and yeah, it's really important. So yeah, very exciting.
Thank you. Dan, I've got my next question for you, and on the assumption that the breeding programs are going really well and the birds are being released and releases are successful, how do we get a sense of numbers in the wild and what's happening?
Yeah, there's a few ways that we get a picture of what's happening in the wild. So the first major one is actually the major drop-off in public sightings of the bird. So there's a public sightings registry, and that's declined majorly. We've also got long-term monitoring. BirdLife's transects have been going since the mid-90s.
Sorry.
No, go on.
Well, we had one particular program that went from about 2000 to about 2010 or 12, I think.
Yep.
That was where we were monitoring a number of specific sites using a methodology that had been developed by the recovery team in an effort to see if we could actually determine the trend in population. And that survey did end. The results were a bit equivocal. It's no easy task to try and determine population trends in a species which has a very small population and which has a very regular nomadic pattern of movements. So, obviously the numbers present in the Capertee each year vary very considerably. So it was quite difficult. So it was it's still produced a lot of useful data, which has been used to inform some of the later monitoring by BirdLife Australia and by ANU.
And so further from the BirdLife ones is National Regent Honeyeater Monitoring Program. That's been going since at least 2015 with a standardised sort of different approach. So for a lot of bird species, transects or quadrates, occupancy-based sort of models are a reasonable enough way of estimating populations, but as Ian sort of alluded to, detecting Regent Honeyeaters is quite difficult. So we use a slightly different approach with playback monitoring, and we've got about 5 years worth of data on that, which shows a pretty grim outlook at the moment. And from all of that, then we can start to do some sort of ecological modelling. So this year there was a population viability analysis done. So that kind of takes a whole range of different forecasts using different parameters, things like conservation actions and captive breeding introductions, habitat protection, etc., and models a few different trajectories based on a few different starting points, because of course we don't know exactly how many regions are out there, but we have a fairly confident range, and so we use a few of them to say where we're going. Is that clear enough? I'm not sure.
Thank you. When I was having some of my early conversations with the panel, there was a very funny story that came up in a conversation between Ian and Carol, and it sits around tracking. So I might start with Ian. Can you tell us a little bit about satellite tracking that happens?
Well, I'm not sure that there's actually any satellite tracking underway yet. That's the latest development. I know BirdLife has acquired some satellite transmitters, but I don't think any of those have been fitted yet. Previously, the main form of tracking was using small radio transmitters which were attached to the bird, and the idea is that you can then follow those and see whether that works quite well, but in relatively limited areas, because the range of over which you can pick up the signals is quite small.
And Carol, your story.
Yeah, so back in 2000, between 2000 and 2003, was when we were radio tracking. So first, the birds have to be caught in mist nets and banded, and little radio transmitters attached. And we're sort of talking about this to contrast it with the more modern approach, which is to use a satellite transmitter, which will be a lot better, hopefully. But what we had to do with the radio transmitters was attach this tiny little transmitter to the bird, and the battery would last for about 12 weeks. And it was designed to just fall off after about 12 weeks so that the bird didn't have to wear it for the rest of its life. But so this little radio transmitter would put out a signal, and then we would have to stand and wave around this aerial until we got a signal, and that would tell us the direction that the bird was, and then we'd have to follow that and until eventually finding the bird, which was a considerable amount of physical effort. Remember that this was in the middle of summer. We were doing this in the Capertee Valley with these, tall escarpments all around, and so you get the radio signal, but because of the cliffs you'll find that there's a bit of echo, so you might be following it that direction, but you're following an echo and the bird's actually over there. So eventually you locate where the bird is, but that only and the birds were leading us up these steep scree slopes, so then we'd have to, climb all these mountains in the middle of summer, and it was very exhausting work. And then you'd find the bird, and you'd try and sighted so that you could get the colour band combination and confirm that it was that bird, and then it would fly off to the other side of the valley. But also this only worked over a few kilometres, so if the bird suddenly went a long distance, you just got nothing, so it had a lot of limitations, this method. But we did find out some interesting things. We did it over 2 summers, and the first summer they were sort of going up into habitats that nobody ever thought they used. The second year that we did it, they left the valley completely. So, if it showed one thing, it showed that they do different things in different years.
Yeah, I think satellite tracking does hold great potential for actually giving us more data about how they move over large distances and where they go after they leave an area following a breeding season. But until recently, it wasn't possible because you couldn't get transmitters that were small enough to put on the back of a Regent Honeyeater, well, not if you wanted it to fly anyway. And but now that the technology has advanced, that's become feasible, and I think we're going to get a lot of really useful data in the future from that, because one of the big problems has always been you get an aggregation of Regent Honeyeaters breeding in a particular area, and then when that event finishes, they tend to disperse, and we don't have a lot of data about how they move between different areas. Virtually the only information we do have comes from birds that have been colour banded and then sighted. So I think satellite tracking is going to be very important in the future.
I believe there's a model of the Regent Honeyeater being passed around at the moment, so it's quite when it reaches you, it's quite fascinating to hold. Carol, surveys are really important for conservation. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, look, so obviously if you're going to try and conserve a bird, you need to base that on good information, and so surveys are really valuable. And I mean, there's surveys that the general public can do, but there's also surveys that the researchers and that I've been sort of paid to do, and so there's all different levels at which you can survey. But
Carol, before you go on,
yeah.
I'm assuming lots of people in the room know what a survey is. I'm kind of new to this area, so could you tell me a little bit when we use the word survey, what does that mean?
Yeah, okay. Look, I'm aware that on the panel with me I have people from the various universities, so please correct me if I don't explain things quite the right way. But surveying, well, to get the best information from doing a bird survey, you need to use a consistent method so that you can compare results at different times or in different places. Pardon me. There are all different types of surveys. You can do like a transect where you walk a certain route and you're counting birds within a certain distance, or you can do an area search. One of the types of surveys that I've been involved in with the ANU was doing 5-minute point surveys and just doing a lot of them and using call playback. Now, there are ethical considerations about call playback, and I don't recommend that everybody does that willy-nilly, but to survey to survey in a targeted way, if you play the call and then give it 5 minutes and see if you get a response. And if there's a territorial bird, so if there's birds breeding within that immediate area, they should respond to that and come in and see who the who the interloper is. So that's one method, and then other methods are just walking a certain route or searching a particular given area. But as long as that method is adhered to and noted, then you can get useful data out of it. So yeah, there's all different types of surveys. But I mean, it's really important to find out not only how many birds there are, but what they require as far as habitat goes, what their movements are, and also whether particular conservation actions are working. So a lot of the surveys that I've been involved in doing for BirdLife Australia has been surveying the planting sites that Ian was talking about earlier. So all the planting sites in the Capertee Valley, just doing surveys on those to find out what birds are using the planted trees, and that gives us really valuable information about what type of planting sites are most successful, and not just for Regent Honeyeaters but for a whole range of woodland birds, and a lot of the other woodland birds are declining as well. So yeah, there's just all sorts of useful information can come out of doing a well planned survey.
And so breeding is obviously a really important part of the conservation program. Cara, can you tell us what's involved?
Oh goodness, where do I start? Well, first of all, within Taronga, within all the institutions in Australia and our region, we have an Australasian species management sort of plan. So there is a management program associated with all the breeding of managed species. So we kind of adhere to that in a certain way. So you have, first of all, we've got people that look after the genetic population of the species. So this is not just for regions, it's many species. So we have what we call stud bookkeepers, which have all the genetic data for all the individual birds in the whole of Australasia. So essentially what we get as keepers at the start of each season, well before the season I should say, is we get recommendations for who should breed. And this is done, I don't do that personally, but it's done by the stud bookkeepers that run data through programs that will give us our mink kingship and everything that we need to create this robust population. So we get recommendations for transfers of birds between institutions, and then also pairs that we should breed together, and then we will move those birds around to facilitate this, and then we'll come up with how many breeding pairs we'll have each season. This year we've had 3 breeding seasons. We're ending on our third now. We started with 6 breeding pairs the first year. We had 8 last year, and this year we ended with 10 breeding pairs. So those pairs essentially are put together in a specific breeding aviary. So the facilities that we have out at Western Plains are purposely built for a species like the Regent, so really high canopy. So it's very, very high, tall enclosures, and that's just their breeding, but we've got other facilities too, which I'll go into in a second. So essentially the breeding pairs go into an aviary for themselves. They are a territorial bird, as we've just learnt, so they can have loose breeding aggregations, of course, but they still have their own little territory, like many birds do. So we need to keep them separate from other pairs, otherwise the males will fight. And even then, they will still seek out each other in certain ways. We've got visual barriers between every aviary. They can be next to each other, but they can't have that visual. They need that visual barrier, otherwise they'll just constantly try and get to each other. They can still hear each other calling and everything. They can see each other in one little part of the aviary we have, which is where we feed them, so we can easily catch them if we need to. But it doesn't seem to bother them too much. I mean, if we get a bit of a sun hit the panel at one point, they might see the reflection and they might get a bit aggro. But generally, they've got a job to do. They do it well. We essentially just leave them alone. We provide them some material, so we'll give them some coconut fibre, some emu feathers, seems to be one of the best things that they like, and we give them web. I'm literally getting the whole zoo involved in finding fresh, clean spider web, and I could give one pair kilos of it for a breeding season. We essentially just go around the zoo, like everyone's seen Shrek, right? And he goes around with the looking for the web, these big lollipops. So we essentially get like a forked, and we collect. We let everyone know in the zoo where the freshest produce is, and we go around and we collect it. And if it's dirty, if it's dusty, and my first year was drought, was breaking, but it was there was a lot of dusty web, they won't take it. They're very special. So they will make their own little cup-shaped nest. I won't go into details of that too much. We let them do that. They make their own. We don't assist them in that way. We just give them some materials. All their enclosures have native trees and shrubs planted in them, so they can go and pull their own grasses, they can pull their own bark and just do all of that. Once they create their nest, we have a very short incubation period, fledgling stage. And of course, the courtship with the song is very important. So the males will just constantly get right in the face of the female and sing to them, display, show their pretty backs, fan their tails, do everything that they need to do to have that response from a female. Sometimes she'll reject them for a little bit and like, just, but eventually we've had no issues. We've had extremely good success since we've started. So that population is getting naturally boosted. Once we let them have their clutches, so we've already spoken about them being paired up due to our recommendations. We also have a few coming off a few papers that have been published about the success rate of the released birds. We've got a few more protocols in place, such as how many clutches each pair is allowed to have each season. So a lot of the data shows that the survivorship of clutches beyond clutch 2 haven't been as successful as clutches 2 and 1. So we did go for breeding seasons where we only allowed them to have 2 clutches to make sure that we've got that stronghold. There's also a lot of research going into the age of when they're released, which is changing over time. Their pedigree, of course, time of release, if they've had breeding experience before. So this year's release, last year's I should say now, we had a mix of birds that were young, but we also had a mix of birds that had gone through a few breeding seasons in the zoo to be able to have that experience in the wild and see if that is a difference. A few of those things then ultimately lead to our flight aviary. So once the juveniles become independent of mum and dad, we take them out. That's completely natural. They will disperse. They go into a creche first off, and this is where we're doing our song learning and their socializations. Eventually they'll go into our flight aviary. So we have a large purpose-built flight aviary. If you've been to Taronga Zoo in Sydney, it's similar to the Wallamai walk-through aviary. So this is where all the magic continues. So we have our multi-species flight aviary is what we call it. So this is where we have a lot of different species in there so that these birds can get accustomed to other species and not just think they're the only ones that exist. So this is constantly changing within Dubbo. COVID slowed a lot of things down with those movements, but this is where they learn to coexist with other species, use natural resources, and get along. So we've got scaly-breasted lorikeets in this aviary. We've got white-winged choughs, 2 mallee fowl, which don't really have anything to do with it, but they were excess from our breeding program that we used to have. We've got budgies in there. We've got peaceful doves. And we've got more species that are coming on board. So we'll watch that space. So they have to compete with birds like your scaly-breasted lorikeets, of course, big, robust birds. We don't have noisy miners. We don't have noisy miners in the system. We know noisy miners are a big problem out there in the wild, but they are quite aggressive, and we don't really want to have that really association in such a small space because they're not going to be able to get away. So the flight training is very important for the release. So we need to make sure that they are completely flight fit before release. So they go into that flight aviary for an extended period of time before they're able to be released. So I think that covers most of it. Then we get to release them, so that's the main thing.
And that must feel like a job well done.
Absolutely.
So this is a question for everyone. I've heard that the Regent Honeyeater actually mimics other birds, and so breeding in the wild can be quite difficult. So is this true? The idea that the song is mimicked, and is it an issue?
It's probably important to set some kind of understanding of mimicry because, yes, there's no doubt Regent Honeyeaters imitate other birds. It's pretty well documented and appears to be increasing. We could get probably bogged down in the science of it, but generally when you're a mimic of some sort, it's got to be good for you, right? It has to be advantageous in some way. So, people know about butterflies or things that mimic poisonous models, so when they're not in Batesian mimicry or whatever. For regents, we're not so sure. Carol and I sort of had a discussion about this the other day, whether or not they're actually mimics. I am of the view that they're not. I can't see any genuine benefit to a Regent Honeyeater singing like a wattle bird or something bigger, because there doesn't appear to be an obvious advantage to that, and if anything, probably a disadvantage in that if they're not also singing like a Regent Honeyeater, which some have been recorded that sound kind of like Regent Honeyeaters and then like another bird, but in terms of the true, clear Regent Honeyeater song, if they're not singing like that, they're very unlikely to find a mate or become accepted into a larger group. So as far as the mimicry side of things goes, I can only see it as a negative, but that can be confusing because they definitely do imitate other birds. It's whether or not they're doing that freely, interchanging with normal regent songs like a lyrebird or a heath wren or something like that very clearly oscillates between different types of songs. But for the regent, I'm not so convinced that it's mimicry as far as being advantageous is concerned, but definitely do imitate them. You asked if it's a challenge. It is for Regent Honeyeaters, because if they don't learn the right song, then they're not going to mate so readily. Doesn't mean they won't. We have examples where birds that are singing an interspecific song or a song of another species that they do mate, but it's just the probability of that happening is a lot lower, the likelihood of that happening is a lot lower. But also in captivity, from a captive point of view, is that we've had captive birds mimicking very strange species, pitters and things like that. And if that's the only song they know and they're destined for release as part of their conservation priority, we want to go and build that wild population up, the chances of them actually assimilating with the wild population or finding a wild mate and spreading those genetics is a lot lower. So that's a big challenge from the captive point of view.
Thanks for that. Anyone else want to jump in?
I mean, I'll just say that it's interesting. It's an example of different ways of understanding what's going on, because they're imitating, they're mimicking, they're kind of doing it, but it's not mimicry how we understand it as a reproductive advantage or a fitness advantage. So in terms of science, it's not mimicry, but they do mimic. Sorry, and that's interesting because it's a capability of a bird that's quite amazing, that they're able to mimic a range of different species. So they have a capacity to do something that's kind of wonderful. But because it's seen as a disadvantage to their fitness and their survival, which is obviously important, it's perhaps not looked at in those terms. And so we sort of understand it sometimes as a copying error, as if birds are sort of just, little machines and they're just hearing something and spurting out what they hear. But there's agency involved in a range of ways. And so the birds are intervening in the world in some sort of way. We don't quite understand how, but there's perhaps, there's a bit disagreement on this, but there's perhaps some sort of intention there about what the birds are doing and how they're engaging with a range of other species out in the world. So I'll throw that in there.
تhanks, Miles. Was there a specific question on that?
Yeah, I was just wondering, because they're like migratory species, could it be that they're trying to fly in under the radar, like in the new patches that they turn up, and it's like, oh, I'm like you, I'm like a pine or whatever they're mimicking, and then they've got what they call breeding.
Yeah, so that's a really good observation. That's been put forward. There are some papers about mimicry on regents in the 90s that kind of put forward this hypothesis, called Batesian mimicry hypothesis, where by mimicking another species, maybe a larger one, because in the early observations, most of the mimics the models that they would mimic were bigger birds, right? So there's an idea, if I pretend to be a big, red wattlebird or something, maybe I'll be able to feed in peace and nobody will. But there is a problem with that concept, right? Is why make a noise at all? If you want to fly under the radar, wouldn't you just feed quietly? The other thing is that when Regent Honeyeaters have a good population density, they're known to be particularly pugnacious and, defend their patch very well. So I think it's a great idea, and you're not the first person to put that forward, and it makes a lot of sense. But to me, why make a sound at all? You can feed quietly. If you don't want to draw attention to yourself and fly under the radar, you just keep quiet. But there would be people who disagree with me on that. There's definitely jury is out on that one. Maybe Carol might have something to say.
Look, I think when we had our discussion the other day, I think that just came from a different definition of mimicry, and I think you sort of touched on that there. Just all I know is that they do make the sounds of other species, and they have done for a very long time in the wild. Now, whether that's intentional or not, I have no idea. So that's all, really.
Thanks. I might move this along. One thing I'm really interested in is the National Recovery Program. So, Ian, if I can pass this one to you, if you can tell us a little bit about the Recovery Program, what's happening, and what some of the goals are that would define success for it.
Well, the recovery plan, I think the initial plan was released around about 1997, I think. It was in preparation for a number of years, and it's since been through a series of revisions. The plan sets up a recovery team, which is a group of people from state government agencies, academic institutions like ANU, and Taronga Zoo, and various non-government organisations like BirdLife Australia, and it also set up a number of local groups to carry out on-ground activities in areas that were particularly important for Regent Honeyeater breeding. So it's been going for quite a long time. As I said, it's been through a number of revisions. I mean, obviously the overriding aim or the principal objective is to get to the stage where you have a viable, sustainable population. So to stop the decline, and to get to the stage where you've got a viable population. And unfortunately, that goal is still yet to be fully realised. But a number of the other objectives, which are really prerequisites to achieving that, there has been substantial progress on those. For instance, we know a vast amount more about the Regent Honeyeater and its life and behaviour than we did when it started, because there was much that wasn't known about it. And there's been considerable monitoring that's also contributed to that. There's been on-ground activity by local groups such as BirdLife Southern New South Wales, doing things like tree planting and surveys in particular areas. And of course, one of the big things really has been one of the initial aims was to develop a captive insurance population, and that's where Taronga got involved, and very fortunately it proved that they did breed easily in captivity. And then, of course, that was also followed by the releases, and I mean, it's those releases really at the moment that are probably keeping the population ticking along until hopefully some of these other factors that are threatening the region can be overcome. I mean, it's been unfortunate during the life of the recovery plan that there have been a series of major climatic events that have severely impacted the population as well. We had a massive drought, a millennial drought, which seemed to deliver a big hit to the population, and quite a number of very poor flowering seasons. And then, of course, we had the bushfires as well. So we've had all these natural factors superimposing themselves and exacerbating the problem. So it's a very, very difficult issue, and it's really a matter of trying to keep the population going until such stage as this decline can actually be really turned around. But I mean, at the moment, the releases from the zoo are really playing a critical role in that.
Thanks. Here's a big question for the entire panel. Why is it important? Why the Regent Honeyeater?
That's a deep question. I kind of feel like Miles is the philosopher here. I mean, there's all sorts of ecological arguments you could put forward. Lots of people would talk about cascading effects and tipping points, and we could talk about, nobody really knows whether or not losing the Regent Honeyeater is going to start a cascade towards ecosystem collapse or not. Risk I would rather not take personally, but on a more important level is they're great, right? Like, all species are great. Why would we want to lose that? And if we continue to lose things like that, how boring and joyless would life be, really? I think that's a good enough reason in itself.
Can I also add that the Regent Honeyeater is somewhat of a flagship species in that it represents a whole lot of other species that live in that same type of habitat that are also declining. So especially the box ironbark woodlands, the type of dry woodlands that you get just west of the mountains, especially that have undergone such a loss, due to agriculture. So there's quite a lot of species that rely on that type of habitat that are disappearing. But because the Regent Honeyeater is so beautiful, so eye-catching and pretty, and it's got a lovely name, the Regent Honeyeater, it gets people's interest. So it works as a bit of a flagship species. People say, oh, I'm planting trees for the Regent Honeyeater. But in fact, that benefits a whole lot of other species as well.
Thanks for that. Miles, did you want to jump in?
I'll just say for the region itself, I think it's a very timely opportunity to think about how this situation came to be. How is it the case that the regions ended up in this situation? Why have some people have noticed and some people haven't? The program's been going for a long time, and we've heard some of the challenges of implementing that in the ways that we want to. And so what are the limits of our ability to intervene here? And of course, the Regent honey is a really difficult bird. It has these nomadic movements. We can't track it the ways we know. The song's very complex in the way that it's socially learned and so on. So there is an opportunity there to look up, to intervene in a way that helps other birds. But here there's also something that's really mysterious and has a wonder about it that draws us into paying attention to song in new ways, to a way of life that kind of challenges us to attend to the complexities, how a being's held together through a forest, through a song, through a flock, and how those relationships exist together in really fragile ways. And so how to attend to that for the future. And so there's a challenge there in a time of extinctions globally, and for all of us being in this place, having a relationship with this bird and being tied to this place together to think, what's our responsibility? What are the ways that we're able to respond and not to respond? And what sort of inheritances do we have of this history that we need to grapple with in order to think how to move forward?
Thanks for that. I've got a question that's just come up at the back room. Is this?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's something you're going to get to anyway, but I was wanting to hear how important is the Blue Mountains to the survival of the Regent Honeyeater. I'm particularly thinking of the threatened expansion of the highway without pleasing truck movements through this area.
Thanks. So that question was, why is the Blue Mountains important? So, Carol?
Yeah, look, it depends how you define the Blue Mountains. So the typical sandstone plateau of the Blue Mountains is not really the core Regent Honeyeater habitat. So when you're talking about something like the highway expansion, it's probably not going to be that relevant for Regent Honeyeaters. So Regent Honeyeaters live more in the, where you have the box and the ironbark woodlands, particular types of habitat that you tend to get in the valleys or west of the mountains, but also in the coastal areas that are dominated by things like spotted gum and swamp mahogany, and also where you get a lot of mistletoe in the river oaks along the rivers. So that's not the sort of habitat that, they're not a bird that you would come to, say, Katoomba and expect to see. Because it's not their habitat. Now, there are occasional records of them in this part of the Blue Mountains, but they're generally assumed to be birds just travelling through. So when Dan talks about the Blue Mountains population, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you really mean is birds in the greater Blue Mountains area, the most important areas being places like the Capertee Valley, which is north of Lithgow, to a lesser extent in the Wolgan Valley, but also in the Burragorang Valley, around the area that they're going to flood, which is quite a different habitat to the sandstone areas of, Katoomba, Blackheath, etc.
Yeah, thank you. I was about to say we might open it up to questions from the audience at this point. There's a gentleman at the back, and then
I'm a regular visitor of the Capertee Valley, looking for Regent Honeyeaters. And I've done a fair amount of research. But can you tell me from your surveys what months am I more likely to see them? I realise it could be anything.
No, they're definitely, you'd be more likely to see them in the right places there in September, October. And that's when they turn up to breed. But there is variation from year to year. So if they have a good breeding season, they'll hang around till, December, January even. In some years when the white box is flowering well, that'll flower all through winter, so you'll get them through winter as well. But the hardest time to find them is when they've finished breeding, so in summer, especially late summer, and into the beginning of autumn.
Thanks. And John?
Yes, mentioned passing habitat and recovery programs require the maintenance of habitat, which is specific for the animals. Now, one of the problems seems to be between the professional panel is to what extent is agricultural behaviours, changing patterns, land use, clearing, the Commonwealth's got the grass box woodland project trying to cover many of the areas, working with funders. On the other hand, the big elephant in the room is, of course, climate change. And we've mentioned the fact that habitats being impacted severely by climatic change and extreme weather events, droughts, fires, flooding. What is the balance here between the recovery program? Are you looking at seeing the winds improving, or is there given the fact that we've seen significant habitat change across our area where this species is present? And how much is that focused in managing the population, suppressing that, and what extent climate change is making it extremely difficult to maintain that, even get farmers on site?
Dan?
I can have a little crack at that one. There's a lot to unpack in there. I think, obviously, primarily land use change is, in my opinion, maybe Ian and Carol could weigh in this as well, but that's the primary issue for most species extinctions. And remedying that is probably the most challenging aspect as well. Primarily not because it's hard to revegetate, but because it takes a long time. And if you've got a species that, might have 10 or 20 years, are you going to have mature habitat, even if we went crazy on it now? The agricultural side of things, I don't want to speak out of turn here, but my understanding is in the Capertee there's been a lot of farmers that have gotten on board with revegetation programs. So potentially in future new mixed, use, especially in riparian zones, if we can revegetate those, create corridors, there may be some really good utility there. It's not really my particular area of expertise. On the climate change thing, there is no doubt that that's going to exacerbate our problems. My understanding is that the general trend in Australia is that a lot of birds are moving eastward as the climate changes. That may be a big problem if we focus heavily on Western populations, do all our revegetation in areas that birds don't want to use in the future. I don't know that I can really add too much more to a very complex question there, but it's underpins everything else we do. Cara, myself, nest protecting, surveying, all of that is secondary to whether or not there's enough viable habitat in the future. And if we don't increase that, I genuinely do think it's a fairly futile effort to say, here's 500 new birds that we're going to release into the wild, but we're not going to fix any of the problems that led to their decline in the first place. So, the habitat and climate change things are both underpinning any effort that we can make ourselves, I think.
Would anyone else like to comment? Thanks, Dan.
I think one of the other big problems is that because Regent Honeyeaters are regarded as rich patch specialists, which means that they move around a lot in search of the best, richest patches of nectar in the landscape. So, and that can vary a lot from one year to another. So that means that in order to protect their habitat, it's not just a matter of protecting one little patch here and say, well, that'll do them, because they need a lot of different options all over the place. And if the Capertee Valley has a drought, then maybe there's going to be some good flowering up on the northern tablelands or down at Chiltern or somewhere. And we know that they can move those sort of distances. But it means that conservation really should be something that's focusing on a very broad area to give them lots of different options, that they can use all over the place. And I think that's one of the really big challenges. The
biggest challenge is that you can't say, okay, maybe there is a way to get them to stay where you want them to, but that's a different ethical problem. But yeah, that is the fundamental problem, is that you can't just predict this is, okay, the Capertee National Park exists now and that's important, and for 3 years they don't really want to go there and use it. So how do you approach such a broad-scale conservation effort like that is a big challenge.
It is very difficult, and even though their range has contracted, it still basically extends from the Queensland border through to northeastern Victoria. Historically it went further into Queensland and it went into South Australia, where I think John Gould, famous ornithologist, recorded having regions outside his hotel room in Adelaide. But so the range has shrunk, but it's still a very big area, and they can move around within that, and it's a vast amount of land and very small population, so it's difficult.
Got another question.
Habitat. So and I assume the birds are moving east, possibly they're also moving south in the corner. But obviously they are areas where there are more people and more towns. So do the regions, will they go into places where they're making some more smaller focus on habitat, reconstruction, revegetation? So would they go into areas, say, immediately around the town or in the subdivision if there were green space with the right maturity of vegetation and nesting places and that kind of thing? Or are they birds that really prefer to stay well away from people and that kind of thing?
I think that I don't think being close to people is a barrier to them. I mean, there are a number of records, I believe, in Canberra, in the urban parts of Canberra. I've heard of records of them feeding in the planted trees in the Coles car park at Lithgow. And, so I don't think they're particularly averse to being close to people. I think the main thing is to have the nectar resources for them and whatever else they need.
Yeah, I think if you've got a patch with good nectar on it, lots of flowering, then they'd be quite happy to go there, irrespective of whether it was near a town or not. I mean, there have been birds quite close to parts of Sydney, though, in the Castlereagh woodlands, which is sort of not far from Penrith and Windsor. Quite regular sightings there, and they've turned up in various places. So I think if the food's there, they'll happily go there, I think.
Cara, from a breeding and release program, do you have any insights there?
I was just going to piggyback on what Ian and Carol said, also Dan too. With the great thing about every time we release the birds, they have to be banded, and there's certain colours. There's a main colour each year for each each release, and then they've got their own individual bands. They've also got metal bands, and they can come off the plastics. But the great thing about the surveys as well, and citizen science and everything, is people seeing them in their backyards. And there's a very famous to me, bird that was released in, I think, 2017 in Chiltern Pilot, and then he was found in Sydney last year maybe, and they were just feeding in the grevillea, just happy as. So that was a long-standing release bird. So the bands are very important. The monitoring is important, and these monitorings are coming from just people looking at, just looking in their garden and seeing these birds. So I don't think they have too much issue personally with coming too close to people. And also coming, I think there was one cited 5 years post-release. That was released, I think it was about 5 months old, which is a very young bird to release. Since I started, we haven't released birds that young. He was found about 150 k's from his release site on the coast of Victoria. I can't remember exactly what town it was, but just to the east of Chiltern Pilot National Park. So these success stories are really important to see, and then also obviously where they're hanging out in suburban gardens. So we're yet to see one in Dubbo. We sometimes get people calling up saying they have a sighting. There was a sighting in 2019, the first year I was there. He wasn't an abandoned bird, so that was a wild bird. But I mean, I've got 63 regents in my collection, and I'm waiting for the day that one turns up just to see what's going on, but they haven't yet. So fingers crossed, but yeah. Yes, well, Dan and Ross, was when Ross was there as well. They were just chatting about the program, and next minute they're like, what's that? Could hear a wild bird. I couldn't recognise it myself, and they were off towards the black rhinos. I'm like, no, come back. So maybe, but hopefully one day they turn up again. But yeah, there's a lot of, the citizens are very important as well. They can hear it all.
Swagging on this question, because I think it's a great question. One thing I would say is I don't think the urban areas, if the resources are there, are any kind of barrier to them. The issue is the patch size and whether or not the size of the green spaces that we can put into cities can actually sustain a population that is viable, because there are these small population effects, right? So you've got a small patch here that could have 5 birds, whether or not that population is sustainable and can grow. I mean, Canberra's a great example that Carol mentioned. There have been birds regularly turn up in Canberra, not regularly by Regent standards, and there's a lot of green space there, but the effective patch size is really important, whether or not we shouldn't undervalue green space in cities. Lots of birds do incredibly well in them, but whether or not regents could sustain in those is a different question. But I don't think people or cities, they'll go where the resources are.
Thanks. We've got time for one more question, if we have one from the audience. Yes.
I just wonder if the panel could expand on what is likely to happen in the Burra Valley should the flooding go ahead. Do we know how many birds we've got down in there now? Are they likely to disperse and become nomadic and go elsewhere? They're likely to just have their nests flooded. Like, what is the likely impact? Hopefully, it won't go ahead. I just wonder how many there are now.
everybody's looking at me. So, look, the thing about the Burragarang Valley, I think it's a really important area for them, but because it's restricted access, so anyone can't just go in there. That's why there had, in the past, been very few records of them there. But yeah, it's a very important area. So I think it's just, if that were to be flooded, and to the extent that the trees, the important trees down in those important areas were to die, then that would remove a significant breeding area. And at this stage, they need all the breeding areas they can get because they're getting fewer and fewer. So that really is, that's what I think the impact is. It would remove a very important breeding area of which they have diminishing amount of.
Yeah, I think that's true, and because there are only a limited number of breeding areas, and in any given area, in any given year, one or more of those sites may be unsuitable. So they need to go somewhere else. So obviously the more suitable habitat sites that you've got, they've got more to choose from, if conditions make some areas unsuitable.
Thank you. Oh, I can go slightly over time. I've just seen 2 more hands up. Are people okay for me to continue taking questions for another sort of 5 minutes or so, and then I'll wrap? All right, down the front here, and then I'll come up here.
I guess I'm asking for a bit of advice, really. With the res zones, renewable energy zones, are mainly in areas where a lot of woodland species are breeding and living. The transmission lines and those res zones are going to see so much biodiversity loss, it's not funny. When they're doing their environmental impact statements, they're targeting birds that aren't even in those areas. For example, the Little Range Wind Farm was targeting Australian bustards that I don't think any bustard has ever lived in on the back of the Great Dividing Range. How do we get people to look at what is there and put it and take it seriously that these species are going to be absolutely annihilated because of these res zones and the transmission lines?
We got here on the panel that'd like to respond.
I mean, this is just going to be a cynical statement, but probably by not letting developers choose their own assessors, I think would be a good start, because
I mean, this is what's happening. How do we stop it?
I mean, that's not a question for my expertise. My opinion would be that we need to probably start using independent assessors, that developers don't get to choose who goes and does these assessors, because I don't think you get much return business if you say no to every project that wants to get done. So that might be an approach to it, but I mean, it's a very cynical part of me that says that, you've got a friendly assessment that might help, but I'm not an expert on that. So.
And I guess from an advocacy perspective, obviously it's having good relationship with your council and having the discussion with your council and also Department of Planning, and engaging with policymakers in that space. Question up the back.
I just want to go back to reading that significant patch in the Burragarang Valley. Sorry if I didn't get it right. I think we're all thinking this, and I just wanted to say it out loud and maybe, suggest that we always finish the sentence, that if we lose that patch, we increase the chances of them being extinct significantly, or is it significantly, or how do we phrase that to get that message out there? I mean, I know a lot of people have been working on the whole raising the damn wall issue, but, the kind of moral imperative not to lose this species just, it just breaks my heart that we seem to have this conversation over and over again. And the way you were just explaining it, losing that patch
has a significant impact. Then could we finish the sentence to really be clear about how it imperils their future? Or am I just having an emotional reaction to what you're saying?
And I think an emotional reaction is completely valid in this context. I think the important thing there is for the evidence to be understood, known, and communicated, and communicated both within the scientific community, but also within the broader community and to policymakers, and ensuring that evidence base is strong and clear is what we can do. So with that, what I will do is oh, sorry, there was one more question, wasn't there? Was that a hand up?
Yeah, a question to the artists. So I guess, are you going to follow the journey of the bird a lot?
We'd love to. We'd like the exhibition to be restaged, and it hasn't been suggested yet. It would be good to follow, yes, follow a migration.
It'd be wonderful to see it touring. There are a number of spaces that it would be quite beautiful within. It's quite extraordinary. So I do encourage anybody that hasn't seen it to go and spend some time in the gallery space before you leave.
And you need to pay a small entry fee. Sorry. This discussion's free, but the entry into the gallery isn't. But it's ours is you walk through the water presence and absence, which is a fantastic exhibition I can highly recommend. And Lost Song is at the end of the gallery. Please, it's on till the next Sunday, the 29th.
It's worth it. It's really good.
So I'm going to wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's been an enriching and an enjoyable conversation. I appreciate your attendance. I'd also, again, like to thank the Blue Mountains City Council and also the Cultural Centre for having us here, and would also like to acknowledge the funders of the recovery program. So it's the federal government and the New South Wales and Victorian governments that have supported the recovery program. And also I would like to ask you all to join me in thanking the panellists. Thank you for your time and the sharing of your expertise. So thank you all.